evening, everyone. My name is Lydia Sidworth. Today I'll be talking to you about feminism and fairy tales. There is perhaps no stronger narrative thread through the history of Western humanity than that of fairy tales. As far back as 1634, fairy tales have been an integral part of the narrative of culture. In my independent study this year, I studied several hundred years worth of fairy tales. Over time, the tales we studied evolved slowly. Plot points and characters changing with time and with the slow glacial progress of cultural ideas. And yet, somehow, the story of an orphan girl who goes to a ball, loses a shoe, and lives happily ever after is at its bones the same story in 1634 as it is in 2018. Fairy tales, as with most ancient literature, were an oral art form. They were passed down through the generation through bedtime stories and around the fireside, only occasionally being gathered together for print collections every few hundred years. You can see this illustrated in the timeline of the tale of Cinderella. One of the earliest collections that included Cinderella was Bastille in 1634, followed closely by Charles Perrault's collections in 1697. That's the tale you might be the most familiar with because it's the one that Disney based the 1950 movie on. The most famous collection of fairy tales were the Grimm brothers, and that was actually only in 1812, comparatively not that long ago. And then we had two Disney versions, one 1950 and one again in 2015. So these tales usually took up some type of moral stance since they were used as a framing device to teach children. They were often used as cautionary tales to teach children what to aspire to. As traditionally, women, who were the primary teachers of moral development to children, they were the people telling these stories to children, and that also gave women an art form as well. They would tell their daughters these stories, and their daughters would tell their children, and it would be passed down for hundreds of years. Considering this, it's not surprising that a majority of fairy tales that have stood the test of time revolve around women and marriage and children. These stories, having been a part of the narrative for 400 years, close inspection, reveal much of the history of the role of women in the narrative of history and women's role in the culture, both past and present. As we track these timeless female stories through literary history, we'll eventually make our way to our own time and examine how fairy tales are told today, questioning what place fairy tales have in modern feminism. So first, as a newly graduated English major, I'd like to start with some vocabulary. First, we have OG fairy tales. I will refer in this presentation to pre-1900 fairy tales as OG or original generation fairy tales. These refer to the collections of the Grimm brothers, Perrault, and Bastille. Post-1900 tales will be recent retellings. Also, you will notice I will not be using the phrase fractured fairy tales. I object to this phrase because, as you'll see, fairy tales have slowly evolved over time, and their metaphorical consistency is much closer to that of clay than of stone. Fairy tales are not etched in stone, so therefore they cannot be broken. All right, so let's start off with the OG fairy tales. So these are mostly going to be fairy tales from Charles Perrault and the Grimm brothers collections. Three major characteristics that stood out to me when I was reading these tales was the overt racism, sexism, and classism. Shouldn't be surprising considering how old they are, but if you've only ever seen Disney movies, it will kind of shock you a little bit. Another very prevalent defining characteristic were either dead parents or terrible, neglectful parents. There's also a huge amount of gratuitous violence. It was really quite shocking at points that anyone would tell this to their child. Also, there were usually a very clear moral involved. Many times, the violence was used to drive home the moral of the story, such as don't talk to strangers or you'll get eaten by a wolf. So the original fairy tales are dark. It takes a very little scratching beneath the surface to find some truly disturbing themes. For instance, in Sleeping Beauty, the scene where the prince kisses Sleeping Beauty and she awakens is always portrayed as this kind of romantic, magical overture. But if you really think about it, in many of the fairy tales, Sleeping Beauty has never even met this prince. He's just a dude who shows up and kisses a girl without asking her first. And this idea kind of perpetrates rape culture. Not okay. So, despite all of this, I would like to mount a defense for the original fairy tales. After going over all these problematic shortcomings, it might surprise you to learn that I find it very important to defend these tales, especially from a feminist standpoint. It's easy to look at hundreds of years of tales and disregard them as anti-women, anti-feminist, and deserving of being left in the dark ages where them and their sexism belong. I certainly understand this viewpoint. I was a subscriber of it for many years. But when taken into the context of history and the important role they play in telling female stories, the OG fairy tales are more than just damsel in distress princess stories. Original fairy tales represented what women in those times were striving towards. Making an advantageous match was highly sought after for women of the time. Marrying a prince would give a woman power and agency over her life that she could never hope to achieve in any other way. With power and royal position, a woman would have agency over her own life. For instance, in one of the Sleeping Beauty tales we told, it actually went on after the prince and Sleeping Beauty got married. And it turns out that the prince's mom is half orc. So the queen has been like eating children in the area and terrorizing the country for years and tries to eat her own grandchildren. And so Sleeping Beauty, through her power as the princess, manages to defeat the queen and kill the orc queen and like save her country, which I think is a very notable and noble achievement for her. Okay, so now we're going to go over the progression of some of the most famous fairy tales to see how they changed over the last 400 years. We have briefly discussed Cinderella, but I really want to go more in detail to that story. And the thing that I thought was the most interesting about Cinderella was how it really talked a lot about female relationships. So for instance, in Charles Perrault's version of the tale, Cinderella's main goal in life is to get her stepsisters to like her. Like, that's what she wants. Kind of getting married to the prince is like this happy, ironic accident that happens. She goes to the ball just because she wants to go to the ball with them. There's a point in the tale where the prince is like making some serious hard eyes at her and just like staring at her across the ballroom. And Cinderella's paying absolutely no attention to him. And her stepsisters who don't recognize her are like smiling at her, and it's the happiest moment of her life. So at the end, like, it doesn't end with they got married, lived happily ever after. It ends with they got married, they moved to the palace. Her sisters came with her, she was so happy. They loved her because she had wealth. As a reader, you're like, oh sweetie, find some better friends. But she achieves her goal, so go you. In contrast, the Grimm's version of Cinderella, the stepsisters are terrible to her. They're very vain people. And actually, at the end of the tale, Cinderella's birds friends come and pluck out their eyes as a punishment for their vanity. So, you know, not as close friends in that one. A very popular theme recently in especially young adult literature has been fairy tale retellings, especially this book, Cinder, by Marissa Meyer. And this tale is set in the future. Cinderella is a half human, half cyborg. And at the ball, instead of like losing her shoe, she actually loses her metal foot, her metal cyborg foot. So you can see over time, this tale has evolved and changed while still kind of having the same foundation of a story. Interestingly enough, in Cinder, her journey actually starts because she wants to avenge the death of her stepsister, because her stepsister and her were very close. So in Cinder, it has kind of echoes that same relationship that Cinderella had in the Perrault tale 400 years earlier. So, let's look at Little Red Riding Hood. Something I'd like to note is that Little Red Riding Hood has never been adapted by Disney. Somehow even they cannot figure out a way to take out the super creepy factors of this tale. So, interestingly enough, most of the time when you read like a modern version, Little Red Riding Hood, she and her grandmother will chase the wolf away. But in most of the older versions we read, Red and her grandmother would just get eaten by the wolf, and then that's the end. Don't talk to strangers, kids. But my favorite version was after Red was eaten, she actually cuts herself out of the inside of the wolf and like kills the wolf and saves her grandmother. So anyone who thinks that maybe fairy tales are, you know, more than just a helpless damsel should maybe look at Little Red Riding Hood. Just some food for thought.
That was in a modern.
Bluebeard was a tale I was very struck by. It's a tale I hadn't heard before this. So Bluebeard is the story of a man with a blue beard who marries an unsuspecting young fourth wife. It turns out that he had murdered his other wives in a satanic ritual. And at the end of the story, his wife manages to triumph over him, and he dies, and she becomes a rich young widow and has this amazing life. I thought that was really interesting that this was another tale of a woman finding agency through a very difficult situation. Unfortunately, most of the time Bluebeard is presented as someone of African or Middle Eastern descent, so the tale still insinuates that a woman can only have power over a non-European male. Okay, so next we're going to look at Snow White. In most of the versions of Snow White that we read, she was portrayed as a very domestic person. She was only saved from the queen because she was just a really great housekeeper, which showed her as that was the only thing that she was really worth, was just her very good housekeeping skills. Interestingly enough, in a more recent retelling of Snow White and the Huntsman, they felt the need to change Snow White into a character, and this trope is known as the warrior princess. So warrior princess is when they take a character and they turn her into a warrior. This is thought to be a move of empowerment, but instead, in my opinion at least, it presents the character as only powerful or important if they have traditional male qualities, like the ability to fight and kill. As if the only way to make a woman a better character is to make her a masculine character, which I personally find problematic because while it's supposed to provide a better role model for girls, it tells young girls that the only way a character is deserving of being a lead role is to give them masculine qualities. This is problematic from a feminist standpoint because it insinuates that traditional male qualities are superior to traditional female qualities. So, we've looked at original fairy tales and we've seen how they've evolved over time. So now, let's look at some more recent retellings and the